Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Tom O'Grady and I'm Director of the Undergraduate Creative Writing Program here. And I want to welcome you to the first event of the spring semester of the Global Voices Reading Series. This is sponsored by the UMass Boston MFA program in Creative Writing and by the Undergraduate program in Creative Writing. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to mention other events in the series that are upcoming. On Tuesday, March 2nd, that's next Tuesday, we will have at 4 o'clock in the afternoon poet Major Jackson reading from his work, and I noticed one of his books is available already for sale here. And then we jump ahead a month to Tuesday, or a little more than a month, to Tuesday, April 13th, and at the oddly uncivilized hour of 9:30 in the morning, we'll have a reading here with Canadian novelist Nino Ricci, reading from his most recent novel, The Origin of Species, which won last year's Governor General's Award, the highest literary honor in Canada. On Monday, April 26th at noon, we'll have a reading by fiction writer Jill McCorkle, novelist and short story writer, and she'll be reading from her new collection of stories, Going Away Shoes. And then in the first week of May, either Monday or Tuesday afternoon, and the 3rd or 4th, we'll have poet Jericho Brown, and he will be reading from his work and also be presenting the Academy of American Poets Prize to a student. And on a date yet to be determined, we will also have novelist Jennifer Hay, who is our visiting writer at UMass Boston for the spring semester. So watch for the flyers, and we'll make sure that information gets into your hands. Before I actually introduce today's special guest, I want to acknowledge a few good people. And first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank the usual suspects in putting together an event like this. Joyce Pesaroff, I don't think she's yet arrived, but she is the director of the MFA program in creative writing, and my good colleague and friend, and is always instrumental in putting these events together. And also the wonderful Lisa Grego, who is running the camera today. And Lisa is, I guess, really the brains of the operation. She keeps us all going. I also want to thank Patrick Barron, who is the director of the professional writing program here at UMass Boston. And he is a co-sponsor, or his program is a co-sponsor of today's reading. And Steve Sutherland, professor of many of you, in the advanced nonfiction writing class. You're comprising today's captive audience. I also want to thank the staff of the bookstore, the manager, Teresa, who got books on relatively short notice, and also Brian, who helped to get everything set up for us today. And so both of Michael's books that I'll be mentioning shortly are available for sale, and he'll be happy to sign them after the reading. And I also want to give special thanks to Michael's publisher, Judith Burwich, who is here today, and she's doing double duty as his chauffeur. So thank you, Judith, for delivering Michael. That set my heart at ease. In acknowledging Judith, that provides me with a perfect segue for introducing Michael Greenberg. I met Judith truly by accident last fall at another literary event. And in the course of our chatting, she asked me if I had ever heard of Michael Greenberg, one of the authors she publishes with Other Press. And I had to admit to her, I've not heard of him, until she added, you know, he writes the freelance column in the Times Literary Supplement. And I then exclaimed, that Michael Greenberg, I love his writing. And I do. And long before I met Michael, which was later last fall, I've been reading him for years. He wrote his wonderful freelance column in the Times Literary Supplement for 6 years. And many times over those years, as I would read his weekly column, I would come away muttering, what a lucky guy. He has the ideal writer's gig. A word count, a deadline, a guaranteed audience, seemingly a carte blanche to muse on whatever it is that he wants to write about, and a paycheck, I guess. So, Michael has now gathered 44 of those columns between the covers of Beg, Borrow, Steal, A Writer's Life. And having read that book from start to finish, I can see that the plain and simple truth I imagined about his writer's life is, to borrow from Oscar Wilde, rarely plain and never simple. But when Michael tells his story of the writer's life and the essays that comprise the book, They not only inscribe a writer's life, but they also model it by way of Michael's exquisite crafting of subject, tone, and detail in piece after piece. And he's going to read from 3 or 4 pieces today to share that with you. Michael may be best known for Hurry Down Sunshine, his memoir of coping with his teenage daughter's manic depression, which was named by Time magazine as the best book of the year several years ago. Copies of that book are also available here in the bookstore. But today he's going to read from and talk about Beg, Borrow, Steal, A Writer's Life. Please welcome him to UMass Boston.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thanks to the program for having me. Thank you, Tom, for that lovely introduction. It really seems like a great actual reading series. Some really fine writers coming along. So it's kind of lucky being a program that has all these. You know, the writer's life, when I collected these, well, let me just say that when I was first given this column, and I was at the end of my rope as a writer, because the writer's life is so improbable and so unpredictable. And to call it a career would suggest that it has anything to do with anything else in life that resembles a career. Most jobs do have a career path of some kind or another, with predictable stops and goes. Writing has none of this. And to embark upon the writer's life is to embark upon an uncertainty and an adventure and an unpredictable path that was not only unpredictable in terms of what it will do to your life and what you'll do to continue writing, because writing is a kind of an addiction that you have to support. It's a bit of a drug when you start out, you know. I've had jobs after jobs to support my writing habit as I began to think of it when it became a burden. I have to maintain this habit or I won't be a writer anymore. And I had children very young. I had a son when I was 20 years old. There's an essay in the book that tells you how that happened if you're curious to know. When I was like a middle-aged man in my 20s while all my friends were running around, I was worried about supporting my son and then my daughter. And I had the idea, a rather mistaken idea, I think, that I shouldn't have a backup profession. Because if I had a backup profession, it would end up being my profession. And the writing would become secondary and I'd become a weekend writer. So I submitted myself and my family to a life of semi-poverty for years. Because I was so afraid to take on a career that would challenge my precarious, threaten, I should say, my precarious identity as a writer in my 20s. I don't recommend that path, but it's what I did. And it did make writing a desperate pursuit for me. And I think in some way, it harmed me and helped me. When I got this column, my editor said, now this is a column like this doesn't really exist in the United States. It is a very lucky column. I mean, I had an audience, I could write, it's absolutely true, I could write whatever I wanted. The only time I ever had a piece, was told that a piece couldn't run, was when I wrote something satirical about Rupert Murdoch, who I forgot owned the Times Literary Supplement. Because he owns so much, he probably doesn't even know he owns. And that was the only time that I was asked to refrain from publishing. I had 6 hours to write something else, which was really quite a challenge. Because I'd usually spend 4 or 5 days on these pieces at the very least. I took them very seriously. My editor told me, the first thing he said to me was, You can write about anything you want, but try to spill a drop of blood in each piece when possible. And he meant my own blood. Well, sometimes you spill someone else's as well. Because when you write about people, you're always cutting them a little bit, even when you think the portrait is the most flattering possible. People don't like to be objectified in print. It shocks them. It's very interesting. I learned this from the column, and you'll see this as writers. When you write about people, without malice, very often they don't like it. And it's very perplexing, and then you start to realize why. People don't like to see themselves objectified. You know the old primitive, supposedly primitive idea, of course this is true in Orthodox Judaism, among Muslims, in many primitive societies. The idea that when your photograph is taken, a piece of your soul has been taken because the image of you. So I think it's actually true when people are written about, they feel that a piece of their soul has been taken. So spill some blood. Well, you can't spill blood every time. And each piece would be in the first person, and it should come from some kind of personal necessity. So that was quite an assignment, right? To write hundreds of these. It was funny, you know, they're all stories. They're really stories. And they're stories taken from life, but they're structured as short stories. And they're really about the quotidian, life as it happens. In most cases, I'm not looking for a grand subject. I'm looking for simply the substance of life, the simplest things of life. That actually, I used to think when I started out as a writer, and for many years, that storytelling was an artifice, was something artificial that we do to make sense of the real life, which is chaotic and not really composed of stories, but it's completely chaotic and arbitrary. And we write stories to kind of comfort ourselves with this ordered beginning, middle, and end. But then, even prior to this column, when I began to keep a journal, I began to realize that actually our lives are composed of stories, and there are always several stories going on. There's one that's ending, some contretemps with a friend, a relationship, a parent. There's one that's just beginning, there's one that's in the middle. And when you keep journals, you realize that these things have arcs and they end, and actually our lives are composed of stories, and it's a natural outgrowth of who we are. This was a great revelation to me and gave me confidence again in storytelling, that it's not an artifice. Not that there's anything wrong with an artifice. Of course, all writing is an artifice in some way. When you write, you're performing. And you're performing for an audience whom you want to keep interested. So it is a performance. And a performance is always an artifice, but actually the guts of a story, and readers know this, readers feel this, when it's real and when it's coming out of something real, and when there's a drop of blood. It's not a construct, that it really is a reflection of the lives we live. So this gave me great confidence in writing, again, at a time when I was losing it. One would read Nabokov and all these fantastic writers who were constructing worlds, and postmodern self-consciousnesses upon self-consciousness. I don't write this way. I don't have this sensibility. I used to be very intimidated by them. But now I just enjoy them. So I'm going to read a story that's a bit of a character study. It's called A Tailor's Fortune. I have been visiting my mother this week at an East Side hospital where she is recovering from surgery. Each time I go to her room on the 8th floor, I think of Yakov Shonlos, my former Lower East Side neighbor, who was brought to the same hospital in 1985 after suffering a heart attack in the East Broadway subway station near the building where we lived. Yakov, or Jack, as he called himself in New York, was born in Lodz, which is in Poland, in 1922, the same year as my mother. Though their fortunes in every other respect could not have been more different. Jack was a minute, unnoticeable figure with a forkful of gray-brown hair, a parched voice, and thick tortoiseshell glasses that he seemed constantly to be repairing with a tube of glue and a paperclip. His father had taught him to be a tailor, a trade that Jack said had saved his life on more than one occasion. In 1940, he was cleaning toilets in the administrative building of the Bürgermeister, where a Nazi official advised him to clear out of Poland without delay. Jack made it to the Soviet-controlled border at Bialystok, where a Russian guard let him through in exchange for his sweater. His skill with the sewing needle landed him a relatively benign position in a sweatshop in Uzbekistan, which was part of the former Soviet Union, where he lived through the war with no idea of what was taking place in Europe. Returning to Lodz, his hometown, in 1946, directly after the war, Jack discovered that he was the only member of his family who was still alive. He moved around Europe for a while, throwing himself into what he called the gutter life of a petty black marketeer. And then, in the early 1960s, settled in New York. When we met in 1978, he was working in the basement of Macy's department store, hemming trousers and letting out waistlines. We stood out as the palest tenants in our enormous government-subsidized apartment complex on Cherry Street. Cherry Street is a street in Manhattan where the Lower East Side meets Chinatown, right by the Manhattan Bridge. It was a very rough neighborhood in those days. And we lived in what was essentially a housing project, a 26-story housing project. This was one of the things I consigned. I, who had grown up more or less as a middle-class person, was riddled with guilt for bringing up my children in a situation that was déclassé. I was going down from where I had grown up. I later realized it was the best thing I could have done for them. Jack and I stood out as the palest tenants in our enormous government-subsidized apartment complex on Cherry Street. One night I invited him for dinner, and he showed up with a store-bought cherry pie. Thereafter, he dropped by whenever he pleased, which wasn't often. He wore a baggy woolen sweater 12 months of the year, and his ill-fitting shirts were alteration jobs from Macy's that had never been claimed. His wardrobe were clothes that he had altered for other people that were never claimed. He had a rare capacity for solitude and a feeling of misanthropy that seemed to run so deep, I wondered if it was innate rather than a scar from his wartime misfortune. He confided in me that only once had he slept with a woman he didn't pay for, a terrifying experience because their lovemaking seemed to imply a promise that he had no ability to fulfill. It was a mark of his honesty and goodwill, he believed, that he didn't pretend tenderness where there was none. When I came to see him in the hospital after his heart attack, he told me in an urgent, whispery voice, "I've put away a lot of money. You should have it. I don't want it to go to waste." He asked me to write out the bequest for him to sign right there, though in his agitation, he could barely make himself heard. I thought he was imagining the money, and, as always with the mortally sick, I regretted shoving my good health in front of his nose. "We'll take care of it tomorrow," I said. "The nurses want you to rest." The next day, I learned that Jack had died during the night. I realized that I had underestimated the meaning of his visits to us. Remembering his extreme frugality, motivated less by meanness, it seemed, than by an ethos of self-deprivation that was second nature to him. I felt sure that the money he had spoken of actually did exist. It was moving to think that, knowing I was broke, Jack had wanted me to have it. But why had he waited until almost the moment of his death to make the announcement? I did nothing for 2 or 3 weeks. Then one day I spotted a letter addressed to Jack lying by the mailbox. It was from Bank Hapolim in Israel. The building superintendent had scrawled the word deceased on the envelope and left it for the mail carrier to retrieve. I swiped the letter and opened it in my apartment. It was a routine notification that Jack's 90-day certificate of deposit in the amount of $107,344 was due to mature. The bank would renew it unless Jack instructed them to do otherwise. I berated myself for having denied Jack the satisfaction of knowing his dying wish could be fulfilled, and imagined my money lost in an eternal interest-accruing orbit. A couple of months later, a man named Miller came to see me. He had heard from people in the building that I was a close associate, as he put it, of Jack. Would I mind answering a few questions? Accompanying Miller was a man in his early 50s called Chaim, with a slight tremor that suggested an early stage of Parkinson's disease. Miller explained that Chaim was the son of Jack's sister and the only other family member to have come out of the Holocaust alive. I'm representing him. He doesn't talk English, said Miller. Chaim had traveled from Israel to be present at the reading of Jack's will, of which Chaim was the sole beneficiary. I dimly remember Jack speaking with resentment of Chaim after he had tracked Jack down and contacted him for the first and last time. Jack had turned him away. He said that he had come to grips with the complete obliteration of his bloodline. He had lived as if there was no one. To learn suddenly that his nephew had been alive all the while threatened to tear apart what little I built of myself since the war. Referring to Chaim, Miller said, "You should know that this man is a child alumnus of Auschwitz." And at this, he launched into a diatribe against Jack. Do you have any idea of the cruelty of that bastard who you called your friend? Jack's will had directed Chaim to a safety deposit box at a bank on Grand Street. The box was empty except for a set of false teeth, painted gold. For what reason this ugliness? Asked Miller. What did he stand to gain? I handed Chaim the letter from Bank Hapolim with the odd sense that Jack had arranged things so I would play exactly this role. A hasty deathbed bequest would have been of dubious legal value. Chaim was the heir of record. You should have no trouble claiming this, I said. Miller seemed caught between astonishment, delight, and new heights of indignation. He threatened to have the postal inspector investigate me for tampering with the mail. Then he shook my hand vigorously and hurried away with the letter and Chaim. That's the story. So these are the kind of stories, you know, it's fun to do character portraits and to pull things from your memory and kind of recreate them with a new urgency. And trying not to let this thing... I'll read another one, which is also a character study. And the thing about being a writer is It's not so much what you have to say about yourself, but what you have to say about the world and others. I think that this is what makes writers valuable. In spite of the fact that I wrote a memoir, and that these are all pieces in the first person, and it would seem like a self-involved memoirist who's always writing about himself. In fact, I only use myself as a frame most of the time to write about others. And I think the way we see the world and the way we see others is what writers have to give. Writers are thinking about the world in a different way. We have a private streaming narrative going on in our head about what makes something interesting, what makes something embarrassing, what makes something awkward, what makes something sublime. And we want to give form to this. Sometimes it's the simplest things. Of course, when I was starting as a writer, to go back to those days, when I say starting out, I mean my first 10 years as a writer, I always thought, you know, the subjects had to be big. They had to be dramatic. They had to be important. They had to be socially important. They had to scream importance, significance. Then I began to realize that when you're screaming significance, everybody runs the other way, you know? And that in fact, you'd be surprised at what's significant. And sometimes just going back to the very small brings you to the large. This is called, not that this will do that particularly, this is called Lobster Shift. Clarence phones to give me the good news. He has landed a job as motorman on the New York City subway, the consummation of a lifelong romance with trains. The rare note of excitement in his voice delights me. I have known Clarence since he was 10 years old, a timid boy who would spend hours with my son Aaron, hunkered over the Lego blocks they both loved to play with. Since then, we have kept in touch intermittently. At his request, I would cook up the occasional job recommendation, and he would fill me in on how he was getting along. In recent years, I've watched him grow into a solemn, increasingly reclusive young man. He lives alone in the same Harlem apartment where he grew up, an only child. His powerful body, augmented by weightlifting and a complicated array of high-protein drinks, gives him a vaguely explosive air. His latest job, at a local drugstore chain, ended when he accused the chairman of the company of running the company like a slave ship. To Clarence, the subway has always been less a means of conveyance than a destination in itself. As a teenager, he would gaze out the window of the front car, studying the various signals and switches, teaching himself to read the iron. That's what trained people say. The tracks, you have to read the iron. In Riverside Park one day, he discovered an entrance to the underground tracks for the long-distance passenger trains that come in and out of Penn Station. He would walk the tracks to the northern tip of Manhattan while the locomotives blew by, making him feel, he once said, like he was being lifted off the ground. Sunlight through the vents would reveal the so-called mole people who lived down there, a rank collection of outcasts who sharpened Clarence's sense of the city's tunnels as an esoteric world known only to the initiated few. I've been operating for 5 months, he tells me now on the phone, but I didn't want to call you till I was certain the job was mine, because of course you have a probationary period. I accept his invitation to ride with him the following day, Christmas. I'll be working the Lobster shift, he informs me, 4 p.m. to midnight. Midnight to 8 a.m., of course, is the graveyard shift. 8 or 9 a.m. to 5 is the day shift. And the shift in between, the swing shift, some people call it the Lobster shift, I guess. I meet up with Clarence at Pelham Bay in the Bronx, an outdoor station with a cutting wind on its elevated platform. He greets me in his blue motorman's uniform and a crimson Santa hat topped with a furry snow-white ball. "Merry Christmas," he shouts. I have never seen him so confident or at ease. He will be operating one of the newest trains in the system, he says, the R-142, a soda can on wheels. He shows me into the motorman's cab with its cushioned seat and computerized trouble screen that tells you everything except if a passenger's sleeve is caught in the door. Clarence inserts two long-bladed skeleton keys into the control panel, releases the brake, and the soda can slides forward, a little tentative on the icy rails. The view from the cab is thrilling. Diamond switches on the tracks being swallowed beneath us, steel dust pouring from the rails, a cross made of gnarled bones in a passing apartment window. Clarence is intent and mostly silent, careful not to lose face by overshooting the stations. As we cross the Harlem River and lay into the long downgrade to Manhattan, he brings the train up to 53 miles per hour and breaks into a huge smile. In the tunnel, it's a different world. On the coarse bedrock walls shines the Byzantine tag of Zane Smith, a graffiti artist whose penetration into the subway's most inaccessible shafts remains a source of wonder and fame. To Clarence, the graffiti is a comforting sight. Cave drawings from the prehistoric 1970s, when ungoverned trains got up to 70 miles per hour, flaggers openly smoked ganja on the job, and maintenance crews ripped spikes from one section of track to repair another. Back in the good old 1970s when everyone was bankrupt. The city. We might be back to those days soon. Relatively few trains are running today, and the signals are green all the way to Brooklyn Bridge, where we turn around and head back uptown. I leave Clarence's cab to wander through the cars. At Astor Place, a woman with delirious red hair and two large suitcases clatters aboard. She removes her platform shoes, props her feet on the suitcases, and falls asleep snoring. At 96th Street, she bolts awake and hurriedly disembarks. This is the unofficial color line. North of here is East Harlem. At 125th Street, the middle cars fill up for the Bronx leg of our journey. An off-duty security guard performs a brief James Brown impersonation, then plops out of breath into the arms of his companion. The subways are fantastic, really. They're constant scenes of performance. It's like you walk into a subway train in New York, and it's a buzz. You feel like you've entered a cocktail party. But it's not a highfalutin cocktail party. When the train emerges again onto the elevated tracks, we stir like people in a room where the blinds have suddenly been opened. Cell phones pipe up, each with its customized ring. The young man sitting next to me writes intensely in his notebook. I look over his shoulder and read, "I'm in love with my best friend's wife. She calls me when they get into fights. He calls me when he needs a crib for the night." At Parkchester Avenue, the car empties and I am alone except for two mariachi guitarists splitting their tips on the seat between them. Clarence eases us into Pelham Bay, the end of the line. The brakes dump their air with a colossal sigh. 8 p.m., lunchtime. With difficulty, we find a deli that is open and return to the station. To get out of the cold, Clarence unlocks a storage room filled with scrub brooms and several gallons of disinfectant. While we eat, he tells me about the blackout last August, right in the middle of evening rush hour, his first week operating without an instructor. The conductor led the passengers out the nearest escape hatch, while Clarence was ordered to stay with his train. It was pitch black, infernally hot, and silent except for the occasional tinkle of water dripping from the beams. He was asleep when the power came on, like a hum. No, I'm sorry. He was asleep when the power came on with a hum, like a swarm of bees. The blast from the air conditioner made my teeth chatter. I was so soaked with sweat. Then I heard the first train move somewhere down the line. It sounded like thunder. At home that night, I listened to Duke Ellington's Take the A Train with its hard swing and echoing bell cord like a subway horn. The next morning, I phoned Clarence to thank him for the ride. I never thought this could happen to me, he says, doing what I love on Christmas and earning double time. So this is a story. It's really a story about someone who has finally found a way to do what he loves, which I always thought was sort of like, I mean, here was a guy who you wondered if he would ever find his place in the world. He found what he loves. And, you know, I kind of feel that way about writing when I was finally able to make a living as a writer. I really felt like, you know, here I am doing what I love on Christmas, and every day suddenly became Christmas. And it really seemed quite amazing to me. So I felt like I understood Clarence. And I'm going to read one more, and then we could all talk, and I'm glad to talk with you about anything you want to talk about. I'm not sure which one to read. Maybe I'll read one about being a hack writer. For many years, since I didn't have a backup profession, and the only thing I could do was writing, because I found myself in the situation of writing for money as a writer for hire, which was so humiliating to me. Doctoring film scripts, writing, ghost writing, celebrity or semi-celebrity, or wishes he or she were a celebrity stories, writing radio ads, whatever. And I thought, well, I have really destroyed my relationship with writing here. You know, I wish I did have a backup profession. I wish I were a high school teacher or something. At least there would be some integrity. Here I am, a hack. I've become a hack without ever having become the writer I wanted to become. Well, this is part of the writer's life, you know. Sometimes you have to be a hack, a jobber, as they say in England. And trying to figure out. All right, I'll read this one. This one's called Zebra. In the early 1980s, cured by my first novel of any illusions I'd had about the glories of self-expression, I decided to approach writing as just another part-time venture, like selling cosmetics or driving a cab, both of which I did at various times. When a friend recommended me to a former Manhattan restaurateur who sought a ghostwriter for her tell-all memoir, I leapt at the job. My employer, a middle-aged Parisian with gold clamshell earrings and pulled-back blonde hair, had been the proprietor with her ex-husband of a 4-star restaurant on the Upper East Side. Henry Kissinger was one of our regular diners. So was Leonard Bernstein, Beverly Sills. They all came, and not only for the food, for the atmosphere, the discretion, she said. At the height of its popularity, the restaurant closed down owing to an almost generic scandal involving tax evasion and the increasing appetite of the would-be memoirist's husband for Armagnac, which is a cognac of sorts, and cocaine. Typical restaurant story. We agreed I would be paid by the hour. Each morning at 10, I would arrive with my legal pad at her small, overfurnished apartment in a white brick high-rise on 3rd Avenue. My gilded slum, she called it. With the imperiousness of the hostess whose welcoming embrace had once conferred on its recipients instant social prestige, she assured me that her agent, Swifty Lazar, who was a very famous agent at the time, was eagerly awaiting the fruits of our labor. Lazar had been another regular diner at her restaurant. He planned, she said, to present her memoir to all the best publishers at an auction. After 2 days, I realized that it would be impossible to extract from her a coherent narrative. She overestimated the dramatic value of her downfall and seemed unwilling to give up the air of one whose invitation to the grand ball had been unfairly rescinded. It was her bookkeeping, in part, that led to the restaurant's demise. Yet her disappointments had a hidden complexity. In the midst of a painful recollection, she would interrupt herself with a shiver and turn away as if she had spotted something revolting out of the corner of her eye. At the end of a week, Swifty Lazar had been forgotten. It was obvious that nothing would come of our conversations. In need of the money, however, I let the job drag on. At least I was less expensive than a psychoanalyst, I argued to myself as I jotted down notes on my pad with an air of sympathetic detachment. My biggest letdown was the food. I had hoped to be the beneficiary of a few memorable meals, but the husband had been the chef, and he was serving 18 months in jail. My employer seemed content with grilled cheese sandwiches wrapped in tin foil from the coffee shop down the street. Since then, I've had numerous jobs as a writer for hire, like a subcontractor who works on various parts of a house without ever building one from start to finish himself. Lately, I've grown suspicious of my ability to manufacture sincerity, to write with apparent conviction about that in which I have no real interest. And I have repeatedly resolved to give up such employment. However, when Zebra Davis phones with what he describes as the perfect offer, I agree to meet with him and learn more. I walked downtown to the Chelsea Hotel on West 23rd Street, where Zebra, he gave himself the name during his brief career as a performance artist in the 1970s. Zebra is currently living. The Chelsea wears its literary history like derelict clothes. In one of its rooms, Arthur Miller wrote A View from the Bridge and After the Fall. Dylan Thomas was staying here when he drank himself to death at the White Horse Tavern. Virgil Thompson, James Schuyler, Brendan Behan, Thomas Wolfe, the commemorative plaques are stacked one atop another on either side of the front entrance. And almost all of those stories are tragic ones. I wait in the lobby among the paintings that former tenants exchanged for their rooms and the cockroach traps discreetly placed in the corners. Finally, Zebra comes down in a sleeveless t-shirt with occult tattoos on his weightlifter's arms. The last thing I wrote for him was a down-market program for late-night cable television entitled Heroic Dogs. Zebra proudly shows me a copy of his latest volume of self-published poems, Hieronymus Bosch Eats Breakfast at McDonald's, the title of the book. This is what really matters to me, he says. The rest is crap, a necessary evil. A necessary evil. I tell you this, Michael, because I know you understand. The author's photo is an extreme close-up of Zebra's teeth and gums. A homage, he explains, to his late father, who was a dentist. Over lunch at Burritoville, a fast food joint near the hotel. You know if a producer's taking you out to Burritoville, what kind of fee you're in for. Over lunch at Burritoville, a fast food joint near the hotel, Zebra tells me about the job. The story of golf during the past 100 years. The budget is tight. The visuals will consist of stock footage and newsreel. because I don't want to pay for any kind of other footage. The project depends on the writing, Michael. 2 hours of voiceover narration. He instructs me to connect, whenever possible, great moments in golf with important historical events. For added drama, I'm to emphasize the rivalry between American and British players, especially in the early years of the 20th century. The Americans come out on top, of course, he says. The program will be broadcast on a cable sports channel. It is to be called The Game That Defined a Century. As I set to work, a familiar dullness comes over me. The dullness of empty language. Golf. Simple. Majestic. Timeless. I begin. Imagine a rabbit hole in the wild Scottish grass. Striking a stone with his stick, a solitary walker aims for the hole. Later in the script, I write, 1922, Americans invent the potato chip. Walter Hagen hauls his golf bag across the pond to capture the British Open. Then, another part of the script, 1945, Allied troops march triumphantly through Europe, and Byron Nelson mounts a march of his own, 11 consecutive victories on the PGA Tour. Augusta National Golf Club, where the Masters is played, is Bobby Jones's masterpiece, a sonnet of landscape architecture. I complete the script and send it off to Zebra. A week later, he phones. An executive at the network has complimented my intimate feeling for the game. Would I be available to play a round with him at the Westchester Country Club next Thursday? Westchester Country Club is one of the most exclusive golf courses on the East Coast. Needless to say, I never entered it. I confessed to Zebra that I had never played golf, except for a few holes of miniature golf on Kings Highway in Brooklyn when I was a boy. Well, tell him you're sick, says Zebra without skipping a beat. Something highly contagious. And what's highly contagious, that's the end of the story. What's highly contagious is that kind of writing that you have to be very careful about. That was a real low point in my life as a writer. But since then, things have looked up. So thank you for listening. And if there's anything you'd like to talk about, or ask about, or hold forth about, now's the time. I wonder if anyone has anything to ask. Perhaps many of you are thinking about being writers. It's yes?
Do you miss writing for the UMass, or other columns that or would you like to perhaps return to column writing?
Well, column writing is a very funny thing because it's like being a farmer. You can't ever leave it. You always have to worry about the animals. You can never take a vacation, and it's fantastic. It structured my entire life. Column writing taught me how to write because it taught me the value of compression. It taught me to watch my language, not in the sense of curse words, but in the sense of not overwrite, to let things kind of tell themselves. It really taught me how to write. But 7 years was enough because it was making it hard for me to do other things. I have since taken another column here in the United States in a publication called Book Form, which only comes out 5 times a year. In fact, they just asked me, what did I want to call the column? I can't think of a name. If anyone can think of a name, I'd be much obliged. I wrote to the editor just yesterday, I said, a name came to me for this column, The Accidentalist. But then I thought, because everything that you write about in a column should feel sort of casual and accidental and kind of creep up on you. when you read it, you know? It shouldn't announce its importance. It should just feel like life, and then it kind of creeps up to you and sucks you a little bit. And that's the way I always liked the columns to be, and I always wanted three things to happen in the columns, you know? I wanted the columns to have three parts. So, I don't know, The Accidentalist. Sounds a little pretentious to me. I don't know, what do you think? I need a title for the column. But no, yeah, but it's only 5 times a year, which is very different than 30 times a year, you know? So it's nice to have a column, to keep that column alive, that columnist person, which is not me. You create a person when you write. Even when you're writing in the first person, it's not necessarily you. It becomes someone else, which doesn't mean that it's not truthful. It just means that you're performing. Anyone else? Yes.
Admittedly, I've not read the entire book, but from what you read and what I was able to read of these stories, it just seems like there's so much more. They are very short and they're really densely packed. And I'm just wondering if there are certain stories that might have stayed with you long enough to consider novelizing or turning into a book. Or do you just sort of let go when you're done writing about it?
Well, you know, it's funny. When I started the column, almost throughout the column, I would write, these columns are about 1,200 words. I would write 5, 6, 7,000 words. I had no idea what the subject was. I just have an inkling of something. And then in that I would find out what was there. And I would boil it down to these 1,200 words and kind of mold it into give it a shape. It was always very hard work. Writing columns, on rare occasions, some just came out whole cloth. It was very rare. I never once felt that by making a column longer, I could have made it better. Although while I was writing it, I would think, God, if only I could make this 2,000 words, it would be so much easier. And in fact, it would have been easier, because to write longer is easier in a way. But I never felt. Now,